Pastor Matthew Harlow was a man who had built his life on trust and devotion. As the leader of the Faithwood Church in Houston, he was known for his charisma, humility, and unwavering faith. His sermons inspired many, and his ability to connect with his congregation made him a beloved figure in the community. His wife, Evelyn, was equally admired for her. They had 2 children, a teenage daughter named Lalala and a young son, Ben, both of whom were often seen helping around the church, embodying the wholesome Christian values that Matthew preached. However, behind the polished image of the perfect family lay a darker truth. Evelyn's mother, Jolie Foster, had recently lost her husband to illness and, unable to afford her own place, moved in with the Harlow family. Jolie was a woman of graceful presence in her late 60s, yet with an air of vitality that defied her age. Her beauty was timeless, with sharp features and a mysterious aura that made her stand out in any crowd. While Evelyn welcomed her mother into their home, she was oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. It didn't take long for Jolie and Matthew to grow close. What started as a comforting companionship turned into something neither had anticipated. Jolie's elegance and maturity seemed to offer something that Evelyn, in her busy role as wife and mother, could not. She had a keen understanding of Matthew's pressures, often offering advice or simply providing an escape from the constant demands of his ministry. She would often invite him to have late-night talks about his struggles, and over time their conversations became more intimate. Matthew found himself drawn to Jolie, not just for her wisdom, but for her physical presence as well. At first, he justified his growing feelings for her as merely a form of emotional support. He told himself it was harmless, nothing more than the kindness of an older woman who understood him better than anyone else. But soon their late-night meetings turned into something far more dangerous. The boundaries they once maintained slipped away, and their relationship transformed into a passionate and secretive affair. Jolie, though older, was still a woman full of desires and unspoken yearnings. She, too, found herself captivated by Matthew's intensity, his powerful presence, and the sense of importance he held in the community. Matthew knew that what he was doing was wrong. He had promised Evelyn, and by extension his God, that he would remain faithful. Yet each encounter with Jolie left him feeling conflicted, as though something deep inside him was craving more. Despite his guilt, there was a magnetic pull between them that neither could resist. The affair remained their secret, hidden behind the closed doors of their home, shielded from Evelyn's watchful eyes. But as time passed, the affair became more than just an emotional escape for both Matthew and Jolie. It became an all-consuming force. Their once subtle connection deepened into something far more perilous. One fateful day, Jolie discovered she was pregnant. The shock of the revelation rocked their already unstable world. Jolie's pregnancy was a ticking time bomb, one that threatened to expose everything they had worked so hard to hide. Matthew's carefully constructed life, the church, his family, his reputation, was at risk of crumbling, and he knew there was no way to undo what had already been done. As the months passed, the tension between Matthew and Jolie became palpable. Jolie's pregnancy was a secret they both struggled to keep hidden. While she did her best to maintain a facade of normalcy, something had shifted within the Harlow household. Evelyn began to notice small changes in her mother's behavior. Jolie, once the picture of grace and poise, had become more distant, her usual warmth replaced with an uneasy coldness. She began withdrawing from family activities, often citing fatigue as an excuse. Evelyn, concerned but too trusting, attributed it to the stresses of adjusting to life after her husband's death. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Matthew found himself caught in a web of guilt and fear. He had always prided himself on his moral integrity, his faithfulness to God, and his commitment to his family. But the secret affair with Jolie was tearing him apart. He had always been careful to maintain his image as the righteous and upstanding pastor, the guiding light of Faithwood Church. But his relationship with Jolie was a dark secret, one that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. Yet each time they met in the shadows, he could not resist her. The strain began to show on him. His once calm and composed demeanor became increasingly erratic. He became irritable, distracted during sermons, and distant with his congregation. The whispers of suspicion started to spread. Daniel Cruz, a longtime church member and a keen observer of human behavior, noticed the subtle interactions between Matthew and Jolie. He began to connect the dots, watching as Jolie grew more secretive, and Matthew appeared to be avoiding his wife more frequently. Though he had no concrete evidence, Daniel's instincts told him something was terribly wrong. He began to quietly observe them, making mental notes of every exchange, every strange occurrence that seemed out of place. Evelyn, though increasingly uneasy, didn't yet know the full extent of her husband's betrayal. She chalked up his odd behavior to the pressure of his ministry and the toll it took on him. However, a nagging sense of doubt began to creep into her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her mother's presence in their home was somehow contributing to the growing distance between her and Matthew. She began to question whether she truly knew her husband as well as she thought. She would often catch him staring at Jolie, his gaze lingering just a little too long, or see them exchanging awkward forced smiles in the hallways. One evening after dinner, Evelyn noticed that Jolie seemed unusually pale. When she asked her mother if everything was all right, Jolie brushed it off with a smile, claiming she was simply feeling a bit tired. But there was a certain unease in her eyes that Evelyn couldn't ignore. As days went on, Jolie's condition worsened. Her pregnancy became more visible, and she seemed to retreat into herself as though trapped in a world of her own. Evelyn, still unaware of the true nature of the situation, began to worry about her mother's health. Matthew, too, was becoming increasingly anxious. Jolie's pregnancy could no longer be hidden, and the situation was spiraling out of control. He could feel the walls closing in on him. His desire to maintain his family's perfect image was driving him to the brink of madness. As the pressure mounted, he realized that something had to be done. But what? Would he confess everything to Evelyn, destroy his family and face the consequences of his actions? Or would he find a way to cover up the truth before it was too late? Each passing day brought him closer to a breaking point, and the fear of exposure gnawed at him constantly. The facade he had so carefully constructed was about to shatter, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The day Jolie Foster disappeared began like any other. The sun rose over the quiet suburban streets of Houston, casting a warm glow on the small family home where the Harlows lived. Evelyn had spent the morning preparing breakfast for the family and organizing church materials for her husband. She expected Jolie to join them for the meal, but when the clock ticked past their usual time for breakfast, Evelyn became concerned. Jolie had always been punctual, especially when it came to family routines. After a few more hours passed with no word from her mother, Evelyn called her cell phone, but there was no answer. A sense of unease began to settle in her chest. She asked Matthew if he had seen Jolie, but he too seemed surprised. His face tightened, as though a flicker of fear crossed his mind. He assured Evelyn that Jolie was likely just out for a walk, or perhaps taking some time to herself, but the longer Jolie remained unaccounted for. The more Evelyn's anxiety grew by afternoon, the family became frantic. Jolie's car was still parked in the driveway, and there was no sign of her anywhere in the house. Evelyn searched every room, calling out her mother's name in a mix of confusion and growing panic. Matthew, always the calm one, suggested they contact the police. He put on his best face for the authorities when they arrived, but deep down, he was consumed by a fear that the secret he had spent months hiding was about to be exposed. Detective Andrea Langston, a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind, quickly took charge of the case. She began questioning Evelyn about Jolie's disappearance, asking about any potential issues Jolie had been dealing with. Evelyn, though devastated, recalled that her mother had seemed unusually withdrawn in recent weeks. But she had attributed it to the stresses of her health and the move to the Harlow home. Evelyn had no idea that Jolie's life was steeped in more complicated matters. As the hours turned into days, Detective Langston and her team scoured the area, following every possible lead. The search became an all-consuming effort, but Jolie remained nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the third day, when a group of hikers stumbled upon a body in a remote section of wooded land on the outskirts of Houston, that the mystery began to unfold in a shocking way. The discovery was grisly. Jolie's body was found just off a narrow trail, hidden from view by thick underbrush. The area was eerily quiet, as though it had been chosen deliberately to keep the crime hidden. The scene was brutal, with deep, jagged wounds on her neck, indicating she had been violently attacked. Her clothes were torn, and there were signs of a struggle in the surrounding dirt. Detective Langston's experienced eyes immediately noted the chilling details. This wasn't a simple disappearance. This was a murder. But what struck the investigators as most disturbing was the realization that Jolie had been very close to giving birth. A blood-soaked sheet clutched in her hand suggested that she had tried to protect herself, but it was too late. The authorities quickly confirmed Jolie's identity, and the case quickly turned into a homicide investigation. The public reaction was one of disbelief. The Harlow family, once seen as a model of faith and decency, was suddenly thrust into the eye of a storm. Evelyn was devastated by the news of her mother's violent end. She couldn't fathom who would do such a thing or why anyone would want to harm Jolie. She had been the one who welcomed her mother into their home, and now she was left with the unbearable pain of losing her in the most horrific way. Matthew, meanwhile, played his role well. He expressed his grief openly, his public demeanor, that of a man struggling with the loss of a loved one. But behind closed doors, a different reality gnawed at him. He feared that the truth would eventually come to light. He knew his involvement, however indirect it seemed, could not remain hidden forever. His fear of exposure consumed him, and he began to retreat into himself, distancing himself from the investigation as much as possible. Detective Langston, determined to find answers, was unrelenting in her pursuit of justice. She immediately focused on those closest to Jolie, starting with the Harlow family. As she delved deeper into their lives, she would soon uncover a series of secrets that would turn the investigation upside down, leading her down a path none of them had anticipated. But at that moment, with the body of Jolie Foster discovered in the woods, the case had only just begun. As Detective Andrea Langston pieced together the evidence, the investigation began to take an unexpected turn. The details surrounding Jolie Foster's murder seemed to point in a single direction, one that would soon shatter the reputation of a beloved man. Langston focused on the relationship surrounding Jolie, starting with her daughter Evelyn and her son-in-law, Pastor Matthew Harlow. Both had been visibly shaken by the loss of Jolie, yet their behavior seemed off in different ways. Evelyn's grief appeared genuine, but there was a sense of unease in the way she avoided eye contact when questioned. Matthew, on the other hand, was almost too composed, hiding behind his calm exterior as though he was trying to avoid the chaos unfolding around him. Langston's first breakthrough came when she reviewed the family's phone records. Though nothing directly incriminating appeared, there were a number of unusual late-night calls between Matthew and an unknown number. The timing was suspicious. Jolie's murder occurred just days after these calls, and the phone records revealed that one of these calls had been placed just hours before Jolie's disappearance. Langston dug deeper, trying to uncover who this unknown number belonged to, but the answer was still elusive. Then the detective turned her attention to the family's finances. The Harlow family, despite their outwardly modest lifestyle, had made several large, unexplained payments to an account under Jolie's name. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a possible error or an overreaction to a family member's needs. But as Langston examined the dates of the transactions, a chilling realization set in. The payments began shortly after Jolie moved in with the family, coinciding with the start of her affair with Matthew. The more Langston uncovered, the more she became convinced that the relationship between the pastor and Jolie had been far more than a brief, inappropriate affair. It seemed to have developed into something much darker and much more dangerous. As she re-examined the case files, Langston began to see a pattern in the behavior of those closest to Jolie. Evelyn had been blind to the truth, and the community had been deceived by a man they trusted with their spiritual well-being. But what was the motive for murder? What had pushed Matthew to this extreme? The breakthrough came when Langston examined the scene of the crime. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that Jolie's throat had been slit with a knife that was found nearby. It was a violent and personal attack, one that indicated the killer was close to the victim. This was not a random act of violence. It was something more deliberate, and it suggested that the killer knew Jolie intimately. As Langston reviewed the evidence, the connection between Matthew and the murder began to take shape. Further digging into Jolie's personal effects revealed a shocking discovery. Inside her room, Langston found a journal, Jolie's own words. The diary recounted the details of her affair with Matthew, including her growing fears about the relationship and her intention to confront Evelyn. Jolie had written about her pregnancy in the journal, and the fear she had about what might happen if Evelyn ever found out the truth. She had planned to confront her daughter, but she had never gotten the chance. Her last entry, written just days before her death, hinted at her decision to reveal everything to Evelyn. a move that would have likely destroyed Matthew's life and ministry. Langston knew then that Matthew had to be involved. With the mounting evidence, she secured a search warrant for his personal belongings and his office at the church. The investigation into the pastor's finances was also stepped up, and it didn't take long to find more damning evidence linking him to Jolie's murder. DNA tests confirmed that Matthew was the father of Jolie's unborn child, cementing the shocking truth. The pastor, a man of God, had killed his lover to prevent her from exposing the scandal that threatened to destroy him. The walls were closing in on Matthew. The community that had trusted him, that had worshipped him, was about to learn the truth. Detective Langston's relentless pursuit of justice had begun to unravel the life of a man who had built his world on lies, secrets, and manipulation. But the most shocking revelation still remained. How far would Matthew go to protect his secrets? And what would he do now that the truth was out? He dared do now that the truth was out. The investigation was far from over, and the answers that lay ahead would expose a depth of betrayal that no one had anticipated. The trial of Pastor Matthew Harlow captivated the city of Houston. Once regarded as a model of virtue, he now stood accused of the brutal murder of his mother-in-law, Jolie Foster. The courtroom was filled with spectators, many of whom had once seen him as a trusted spiritual leader. News of the affair and the shocking revelation that Matthew was the father of Jolie's unborn child sent ripples of disbelief through the community. The courtroom was tense as Evelyn Harlow, a woman shattered by betrayal, sat in the front row. The weight of her mother's death and the betrayal by the man she had called her husband was almost too much for her to bear. She clung to her children, her eyes red from days of grief and anger. As the trial unfolded, the evidence against Matthew was undeniable. Detective Andrea Langston presented a damning case, meticulously detailing how the pastor's affair with Jolie had escalated into a deadly confrontation. The testimony about the secret payments to Jolie's account, the phone records linking Matthew to the night of the murder, and the DNA evidence that confirmed his paternity of Jolie's child all painted a picture of a man who would go to any lengths to protect his carefully crafted life. The most haunting piece of evidence was Jolie's journal, which had become a central part of the case. In it, Jolie had written about her growing fear of what would happen if her affair with Matthew were exposed. She had planned to confront Evelyn, but the diary's final entry suggested she was too terrified to follow through. Her fear was not unfounded, as it became clear that Matthew's desperation to cover up the affair had driven him to murder. The defense, however, attempted to discredit the evidence, painting Jolie as an unstable woman who had fabricated the affair in an attempt to ruin Matthew's life. They argued that there was no direct proof that Matthew had killed Jolie, only circumstantial evidence. They tried to make the case that Jolie's death was a random act of violence, that someone else could have been responsible, but the jury wasn't convinced. The weight of the evidence was too much to ignore, and the picture painted of a man willing to kill to protect his reputation resonated deeply with him. In the final days of the trial, Matthew took the stand. He appeared broken, his once confident demeanor now crumbling under the weight of the accusations. His eyes were hollow, as though he no longer recognized the man he had become. He denied the charges, insisting that he loved Evelyn and had never intended for things to spiral out of control. He claimed that Jolie had become obsessed with him and that her threats to expose their affair were baseless. But the more he spoke, the more the facade cracked. His words were filled with contradictions, and his inability to maintain any sense of credibility only deepened the jury's suspicions. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom fell silent. Matthew Harlow was found guilty of first-degree murder, and the shock that rippled through the room was palpable. Evelyn, her face pale and her hands trembling, broke down in tears as the weight of the decision settled in. She had lost her mother, and now she had lost the man she had trusted with her heart. It was over. The man who had preached faith and morality to his congregation was now a convicted murderer. His life in ruins. Matthew was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence felt like a bitter, just end to a twisted story of betrayal. In the months that followed, the Harlow family tried to rebuild their lives, though the scars of the past remained. Evelyn struggled with the pain of losing both her mother and her husband, and the weight of the betrayal was too much to bear. The church, too, was left reeling. The once thriving congregation that had looked up to Pastor Harlow for guidance was shattered. Many members left, disillusioned and broken by the revelation of their pastor's dark secret. As for Detective Langston, the case stayed with her long after the trial ended. She often found herself reflecting on the destructive power of secrets and the way they could unravel lives in the most devastating of ways. The Harlow case was a tragic reminder that even those who appear most righteous are capable of the darkest actions for the community. The trial marked the end of an era. Faithwood Church would never be the same, and the legacy of Pastor Matthew Harlow was forever tainted by the grisly truth of his secret life. The justice that had been served, though necessary, could never fully erase the deep scars left by his betrayal. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.